Hey, good morning. It's Patrick Lovell coming at you on the Saturday morning, January 28th, 2023 at approximately 9:11 my time. Kind of interesting time stamp there. Um, if you're like me, yesterday was a pretty emotional day. I mean, the videos that were released of both uh, Tyree Nichols and, of course, Paul Pelosi were hard. Um, I'm like this movie buff guy. I'm a producer. I love cinema. I love film, and I'm reminded when I watch, for example, Paul Pelosi and the aftermath of just all the right wing rhetoric. I was reminded of Natural Born Killers, the Oliver Stone 1994 film, um, where um, you know Robert Downey Jr. I can't remember the name of the so-called faux journalist that he played, but he was just more of like an ambulance chaser journalist that was writing the tales of Mickey and Mallory and helped turn them into the cause celebre of the day. And the whole thing was just gross, right? And that was the whole point of the film. And it was powerful, incredible cast, and it definitely left a indelible mark in my mind. But of course, it was satire, and that was back in the early '90s, right? Um, our society was a bit of a mess then. 20, what am I saying? 20 years later, it's more like 33 years later. Well, do the math, right? 6 and 23 is 29. Yeah, nearly 30 years later. And, we're looking at the Speaker of the House's husband being held after, his messages to the 911 dispatch who were asking the most ridiculous questions, considering what he was telegraphing. I think anybody with any common sense would have immediately known he was in dire danger. But she stalled, but it looked like the cops got there right at the right time, but in the nick of time to save his life, but not to prevent him from getting hit with a hammer. And we all saw that on the video. Meanwhile, there's all of these, just again, these distortion rackets, particularly emanating from Twitter that are just nauseating. People blaming him for being involved with all sorts of like nefarious behavior, when he's an 82-year-old man in the middle of the night that's being accosted by some freak with a hammer. And it is shocking that the Capitol Police weren't there or there wasn't better security, all things considered. But I mean, I'm going to leave that where it is because my focus isn't that particular, even though it's just horrific. But I mean, Tyree Nichols hit me very hard. I watched the video many times. I remember, we've all seen incredible videos of, police brutality over the years. And I mean, there's been a lot of comparisons going back to the, everything that took place that created the LA riots back in the late 80s, right? And, you know, these types of things are just nauseating as well. But this is particularly nauseating because they're African American police officers that accosted this this guy who, at worst, may have been driving slightly recklessly. Doesn't even sound like he was doing anything out of control by any stretch of the imagination, but he was cooperating. I heard the audio, and he was just doing what they told him to do, and then they brutalized him like they were gangbangers, looking to send a message. And it was like, my God, this is in the shadow of where Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. And here you have these African American officers, supposedly a part of an elite force called, I think, Scorpion, maybe, um, you know, tasked to clean up, like, I guess a lot of murders were on the rise in Memphis. And I'm sure their tactics are, insane in maybe in some cases dealing with really bad elements and rogue elements. You might want guys to be able to rise to that level, but you would also want them to be able to differentiate what the threat level is. And what they did to this guy, Tyree Nichols, who I've now seen videos of, him skateboarding and understanding that he was a fan of sunsets, and it just seemed like a real decent guy trying to live his life, and seemed like an animated guy, just great charisma, and really great skateboarder, and you know, father to a son, and I know that he was intent on teaching his son how to skateboard, which drives close home to me, quite frankly. I can relate, and I can also relate to the feeling of being powerless against a sort of a force that has the authority to do something that is the perverse inverse of why we give somebody authority to begin with. Now, it's not exactly apples to apples, but I mean, you get a bit of a post-traumatic stress disorder when you think of at least somebody. For me, and my whole thing, if you're just discovering me, is I'm an anti-corruption crusader because I've gone the distance, because I'm an independent investigator and independent producer and investigative journalist that went the distance and unraveled the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history, that is our system. And recently, for example, I revisited another documentary, Inside Job, that covered a lot of the stuff that we covered, but early in the process, and you can kind of look through the long lens, looking backwards at what didn't happen in the aftermath, and you start to look at this, and it's all exactly what it is. It looks like it's a cover-up, and we've seen police departments, over the years cover for officers, and I know there's a couple of different legal semantics that prevent cops from being immediately questioned, detained, and certain evidence that doesn't go into it, and they're basically protected. And they're also, I think that in lawsuits where you have to go through an excruciating trial and all of the other things that cost money, with real attorneys and effective attorneys at that, if they're going to win some sort of settlement that could in some cases take years, that it's tough because you're up against the wall of how the system has circled the wagons to protect its own. And then ultimately, I think the fines are paid by taxpayers, for example. Okay? It's a common theme, right? We heard over and over and over, for example, in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, where trillions of dollars were looted from the central bank that ultimately led to settlements, and a lot of people either misknowing or mischaracterizing, but the perception is that taxpayers, paid for the fines and paid for the bailouts and that sort of thing. It's not exactly the situation, but it's close enough to the mark to where we know that there's a kind of a distortion and a perversion that enables this type of activity, and it's just like, you've got to be kidding me. And I don't know what the fallout's going to be. I mean, I think really, for me, in addition to the horrific madness of both cases that I'm referencing this morning, with an emphasis on Tyree Nichols' scenario, but I've said for some time, for example, that we live in an age where a lot of times these issues become confounding or conflated with identity politics. And here we have a situation where there's African American officers acting like, gangbangers, to viciously brutalize somebody to send a message and with a badge, and that's just as bad as if it's white officers, in the normalcy of, if you will, of white supremacy. And there are executives out there that are attorneys, or people that work in finance, or people that work in all sorts of manner of the law, judges, that could be women, that could be African American, and they could be just as guilty as playing along with the corrupt engine that I refer to as the Borg, as their white counterparts. And so it gets a little murky when you start to talk about, okay, well, yeah, there is a white supremacy, but in the service of what? For me, when I've looked at when I take the long view of this stuff, but I always kind of go first to Harvey Weinstein's HR, right? That was ran by women, and they were complicit in Harvey Weinstein's complicity machine of complicit in systemic rape. That was the whole purpose of the Weinstein scenario in The Couch, to control female actresses so that he can leverage them for whatever reason. And it's a sick, perverse part of the system. And I guess it's, I know for a fact it's been around, for decades, the systemology of control. And if you work yourself through the system, they always called it the casting couch, and people play ball, And, I was in Hollywood. I actually had offers, if you want to know the truth, at scenarios like that back in the day. And I was like, dude, I don't care what your sexual orientation is, but I don't go there, sort of thing. It's just who I am. I'm me, and I'm like live and let live. Anybody can do whatever they want. But the fact that it becomes a systemic sort of scenario to pressure somebody to fit into a culture, if you will, that's where I draw the line. And that's where I'm like, fuck you. And, I've actually paid the price for that by not playing ball in my professional career. And that's why I became independent, to be quite frank with you. But it was also what enabled me to be able to see the forest through the trees and ask the right questions and be able to pull all of the, different threads to be able to understand systemic corruption, which is what fuels police brutality. But behind the scenes, there's also judges that are very much a part of it, particularly in what it is that I've been revealing to you now for some time. And I'm trying desperately to create a convergence, to create a populist crusade of millions of us to purge corruption. In fact, I went to bed last night just feeling distraught, and I don't know if I had nightmares, but I ultimately woke up with a dream this morning where it actually happened, where millions of us came together that were drawn by the light of the evidence that I have and I've laid out, and people start to find it and start to unpull it themselves. And suddenly they're like, wait a second, in the sea of noise and confusion, this guy, Patrick Lovell, has been telling me the whole time that it's the emperor's new clothes and really bad acid. And he's literally got it all on a platinum platter for me to absorb, to learn, to educate myself and educate others. And I'm not going to take this shit anymore. Because, like I've always said, it's not rocket science, it's racketeering. But ironically, I was listening to an offering by somebody I have a great deal of respect for, Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, who is now sort of a leader and, he's a vector for all things analysis of how things work, particularly in the global setting with economies. And he speaks frequently about the 2008 crisis as kind of the starting point to understand the world we live in. And a lot of time he refers to the outcome as techno-feudalism. But it was interesting. I've always had a slight criticism of Yanis because I'm like, he knows so much. He's incredibly intelligent. I guess he's a genius. I don't know. I mean, he's just incredibly articulate and charismatic, and everything that he does and he says, I'm drawn to. Now, I'm not a Marxist, and I'm not a communist, and I'm not a socialist. Neither is he necessarily. Definitely Marxist, socialist. But as I've said a few times in my truth bombs, the most intellectually capable of criticism tend to be those that are socialists and Marxists that I've come across, especially that are economists. I don't completely agree with the formula because I'm a producer, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a free market guy that believes in innovation, and I do know that you have to have the flexibility and all sorts of systems to be somewhat of a hybrid between kind of a free market and a social democracy to be able to provide safety nets. And there's so many smart ways to be able to have, if you had dynamic leaders who understood the entire nexus of the scenarios of how we fund things, could obviously do a lot better job managing our societies for the outcome that, we were born and created to be. The Constitution and liberty and separation of powers and those things that create a dynamic society that holds criminal behavior to account because of the integrity of law. That's what our system is supposed to be. But what Yanis was talking about this morning, what I thought he's had a void in most of his lectures, but I stand corrected because he completely laid out kind of just the opposite of what I continue to say, which, it's not rocket science, it's racketeering. But what he said, and he's actually right, and that's why it gets kind of confusing trying to lay this all out for you, is that it actually is rocket science of corruption. Because of the manner of the revolving door and the level of deafness and betrayal from the professionals within the engine that know better, that can do the mental gymnastics based on who's seeing what, when, and how, and what can be done behind closed doors. And he's referring to the European Union. and how things work, particularly post, um, uh, you know, austerity, for example, right? And just the hypocrisy of it all. For me, as a metaphor, what I learned when I was making my first documentary film, when I was approaching Oz, when I was getting to Washington, D.C., and Manhattan and Wall Street, after a 3,700-mile adventure through the Occupy Wall Street uh, scenario, I had said to my colleague, I said, look, man, it comes down to we have two columns of our soul. We have integrity and character, and we have hypocrisy, duplicity, and complicity. And our soul is navigating between these two poles depending on the circumstances and our level of understanding and our level of what we, rise to. So, for example, somebody that comes out of an Ivy League school with a PhD that gets into a system is going to have a lot different view of how systems operate than somebody, for example, that's working, as an hourly employee at Walmart, right? But a lot of the times, well, I don't want to even go down that path. The bottom line is it's about capacity for knowledge and understanding. And the person who's working, for an hourly wage that's just trying to make income for their families and sustainability to live with whatever they can afford and that sort of thing. And let's say they're living responsibly and they depend on the system for that job so that they're going to purchase, whatever their capacity for livability, that's a standard. And then there's somebody at the hierarchy of this thing that makes everything sort of possible. And we've spent, decades and decades marching to this tune of neoliberalism over the course of 4 decades that's led to globalism, that's ultimately led to this perverse inverse of what we think of free markets and quite frankly, supply and demand, and ultimately the integrity of law. Because what Giannis is talking about today, which is the first time I've ever heard him talk about it, is just the level of depravity that's involved with complicity that enables corruption. And for me, I went on this insane journey where I had to understand what happened in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, to understand what was happening in the courts, that to me was a systemic scenario not too dissimilar to all of the police brutality that we've seen. But in this particular case, it was spearheaded, engineered by the judicial system to clean up what the financial system did to destroy the world. And the reason that all of that stuff is able to happen is somebody has to pay for all this stuff. Is it state taxes that are paying for, the regional and different judiciaries and the Third Circuit courts and so on and so forth to be able to railroad millions of foreclosures? Well, if you just look at it from the outside looking in, and if you've always paid your bills and you've just worked within your means and you've used the system to be able to move up, you can't relate to the fact that millions of people that had no opportunity, no income, would be faced with a situation where they could get into a loan based on predatory circumstances where they were signing loans that they didn't have the capacity, or nor would an attorney for that matter, fully understand all of the different semantics of deception that were taking place in these variety of what we call liar's loans. And it's all the inverse perverse of what you think in context to what determines the outcome. I saw testimony, for example, recently of the former CEO of Countrywide, Anthony, Mazzillo, and he said, "Why would we make loans to people that couldn't afford to pay them back?" And everybody bought it. The point is, he wasn't making loans to people. He was packaging loans to sell upstream, and he didn't care what the circumstances were. They just needed volume, and they were getting fees. And Angelo Mazzillo, ended up making, I think in a 2004 to 2006 time span, something like $480 million off of pure fucking intended criminal deception that he kicked upstream to the warehouse lenders that were purchasing, these liar's loans, what they ended up calling, subprime, but they weren't. They were liar's loans. No income, no asset. And they were like 60% of that time period. And they were loading up to short, and they blew up the world. And he was selling them to all of the different vectors and the investment banks and the biggest banks in the world, who sold them to pensions and to municipalities and so on and so forth, using deceptive acts and practices. It was all a racketeering scheme. Angelo Mazzillo was a big vector, but he was only one of, I don't know, hundreds, maybe thousands. And ultimately, everybody was getting in on the game. And it was like literally tens of millions of felonies went into this that ultimately the judiciary tried to, ultimately was tasked to clean up. I don't know. I don't have the evidence. I've been trying to figure this out for a long time. Did the DOJ actually send, direct correspondence to AGs around the country to prevent them from investigating what actually was going on in these loans? Because what's fishy about the whole thing, and I think it's pretty, straightforward in the end, is that we wound up with billions of dollars of settlements from the banks, and then we also had billions of dollars of emergency scenarios through the federal government that masked the $29 trillion bailout of all of these goddamn financial fraud institutions with racketeering CEOs that were basically the Dons that used this rocket science calibration of the entire system to, pull off the greatest scheme in history that blew up the world. And then they used the full faith and credit of the United States to backstop themselves, and all the central bankers around the world were in on it, which is what Giannis is talking about, in which I'm trying to make you aware of. And so we can see, for example, the brutality of something that happens, like with Tyre Nichols, and everything that elicits, given what we've seen for the last many years that led to Black Lives Matter and so forth. But what about the judges? In the chambers that nobody sees, that are rubber stamping illegal foreclosures, that foreclosure mills and servicers are doctoring, fraudulent documents to illegally foreclose on people to prove that they have standing in court to foreclose based on the law when they don't. They've done this to millions of people, and nobody in media has asked the question. Nobody in media has tried to stop this. Now, I shouldn't say no one. I mean, there was a great piece of work, I think it landed in 2017, 2018, by David Dan called Chain of Title. As it turns out, it should have been called Chain of Land Title, to be more accurate. And he did a subset of information in Florida that was magnificent. That was part and parcel to stuff that, led my investigation that was built in 300 hours of evidence that I have that are sitting on the shelf because I can't get it made for what we call season 2 of the con. And then ultimately, David Sirota, working with Alex Gibney, watched the con. They pulled a lot of people that are in the con to put together a podcast called Meltdown, where they ask a lot of really incredibly smart questions based on what the Obama administration did, but they wanted to take sort of a political approach to the whole thing, as opposed to a deep dive on the analytics of what was happening within the courts, which I have since presented to David Sirota, and David Sirota has ignored it. I'm now working with the ICIJ. It's going to land. It's going to be huge. It's going to, hopefully, land at a time where I'm building a grassroots effort to move the needle and become this thing that I dreamed about last night, where millions of us come together based on the information that I've been providing, where everybody understands exactly what happens so they can't get played, and we rise in this crusade, this massive crusade, to purge corruption. That was my dream. But now I'm back at the righteous grind, trying to configure all of these things that are relevant to everything that we're watching to make you understand the system and the society that we live in. Because we need to come together. This is my pitch to you. We have to come together. So I'm asking you to consider donating $13 to our cause, that we will build a vertical that gets very organized to be able to pull all of the different elements that I have access to and to build a grassroots movement of people equipped with the truth that can reveal that the emperor's new clothes, that this is all of the emperor's new clothes. That there is a systemology, for example, and I'll give you one last thing to think about, as it relates to what I've been saying the past few days, is that a woman by the name of Charlie Javis, who ran an operation like Frank Financial, was basically setting up this convergence of student loan scenarios to be worked through the pipeline of Chase, but yet she manufactured fake clients. And that was the very same thing that Wells Fargo had done, several weeks before, and then many times over the past decade, to where she's become this focal point of the story that was on the front page of the New York Times and everything else, that she played one over on Chase. But there's no mention of all of the different scenarios that Chase has been involved with for so long. What I'm telling you is the financial system is in complete control of our country. The corruption emanates from Wall Street. and they have armies of high-powered white shoe law firms and accountants in every way, shape, or form that can actually influence our government, owns the corridors, as well as influence the judiciary, not to mention the Supreme Court. Yeah, there are bad actors, on the libertarian side, dark money, the Mercers, technology guys, the Kochs, they've been in it forever, the Koch, foundation, because Charles Koch died this year, but, they've been incredibly granular and effective and incredibly sophisticated at what Giannis refers to as the rocket science of corruption. I'll try to, again, break it down. It's really, in my mind, it's not rocket science, it's racketeering. When you understand RICO, when you understand racketeering, influence, corrupt organization, you understand how do you flip whistleblowers and understanding, and you put the composite together, then you have an understanding of what we've become, which is the perverse inverse of a society that has separation of powers and integrity of law. We don't. These corporate forces have worked a hijacked scenario based on deceptive acts and practices and collusion and complicity to hijack the United States. We are not of, by, and for the people. We are of, by, and for corruption. And these guys are fucking relentless, and they rule the world. A lot of you are anti-war. I don't know if I'm anti-war per se. I'm anti-fucking throwing a lot of money into the Pentagon to go fight wars that are feeding the contractors, at the trough of corruption for the military-industrial complex, especially if we're not fighting for separation of powers and liberty and justice for all. I certainly wasn't against fighting the Nazis, right? I was very, and I have been for my entire life, grateful that we firebombed the living fuck out of Dresden and ended up, destroying with the Russians and the UK and the French eventually and all of the allies, the Nazi war machine, okay? There are good wars. But then ever since, we've been involved with this sort of this racketeering enterprise of wars that are basically just creating global capitalism, if you want to call it that, but I call it corporate fascism undergirded by a criminal syndicate. These aren't just words, man. These are the way the game is played. They're different pieces of the puzzle. You got to understand geopolitics. You got to understand policy. You got to understand history. You got to understand who did what and when and how. You got to understand the power. Honestly, it's not that more complicated than if you're a football fan and you know the ins and outs of everything that transpires to make a Super Bowl champion, if you want to know the truth. If you got all of that down, or you can be somebody who goes to the casino and you can bet on every shape or manner of a game that's being played, particularly at the sports book, it's not too dissimilar in terms of unpacking the scenario. But in all of those cases, you expect there to be a fair playing field. So if you're betting on the outcome based on odds and you're hedging your bets, that you've got an understanding based on the calculus of your knowledge to improve your chances of winning. Well, maybe I'm doing the exact same thing for the population writ large that has to come to understand what we actually are and to be able to call a spade and to be able to march in unison so that, for example, all of these different maneuverings of media that can basically carve out some sort of connection based on intellectual, let's just say fervency or cliques or tribalism, where it's kind of like, we're going to say things and look the way certain people look, and that we're going to kind of circle the wagons and we're going to become a unit, right? That's what Tucker Carlson is. He's nothing but manipulation all day, every day for that particular side of the equation. Rachel Maddow, the same. Anderson Cooper, the same. Meanwhile, I'm bringing you the information that gives you the details of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history. That was the largest RICO scenario that has ever been done that hasn't ended since 2009. We've showered trillions upon trillions of dollars to this machine. It's the Borg. If you like, underdog stories, this is the ultimate Rocky story. This is the ultimate David and Goliath story. This is the ultimate fill in your favorite story of fiction of where courageous people without a lot of resources rose to the moment to defeat evil. That's what we've got to do. And the only way we can do that is to get organized. So hopefully this is resonating with you. Hopefully you're inspired. Hopefully you'll get in the game. Hopefully you'll understand that I've got the torch, my friends, and I'm the only one who can put all of this stuff together. It's not because I walk on water. It's not because, I parted the Red Sea. It's because I did the research, I did the work, I actually delivered it. I'm connected to all of the right strands in this system that could turn this upside down, inside out overnight, the corruption that is, hold it to account if only tens of millions of you would join me in this crusade to purge corruption before it murders all of us. Because it will. Because that's what it does. You know the parable of the scorpion and the frog? Quickly, the scorpion and the frog knows, or the scorpion wants a lift across the river, and he promises the frog he's not going to sting him, but the frog's like, you're a scorpion, that's what you do. And he's like, no, why would I do that? Because I'd perish as well. So he thinks about it. The frog says, sure, hop on. They go halfway across the river, and of course, the scorpion does what? Stings him. They both go down, and as he's going down, the frog asks the scorpion, why'd you do it? And he's like, I'm a scorpion. We've got to rise to the moment. Evil is evil. Deception is deception. Transparency and truth have got to lead a movement for justice. If you want to call it a civil rights movement to purge corruption, let's call it that. Onwards and upwards.